whirlwind tour of the ASO Merger Series. I'm going to begin by offering a bit of background overview of what went into making this series and a few words on the merger process itself. And then I'll share some highlights from each of the 7 briefs. In putting this series together with AIDS United, some of our goals included to help make the information as accessible as possible. That's why we really wanted to make sure that it was a series of briefs that were easily digestible and to the point. We wanted to also meet organizations at whatever stage they're at in learning about mergers. And I'll talk about these stages on the next slide. But really wanting to be relevant and to help demystify the merger topic throughout the life of that kind of a process. And finally, and most importantly, we wanted to let the field speak for itself by highlighting some mini case study examples that help bring in the voices of ASOs that have actually been through a merger. And these include AIDS Resource Center Ohio, which actually has a new name now, Equitas Health, Colorado Health Network, Venice Family Clinic Common Ground, and Boom Health. We're very grateful to each of these organizations and their leaders for sharing their experiences. To provide a bit of framing for how the Merger Series is organized, we approach mergers through a process of steps reflected on this slide. Each of these steps is really critical to success and to the process. You'll see each of the blue circles tends to focus on a step of the process that tends to have a beginning and an end. And the arrows in between are more about the results coming out of those processes. So we really begin by looking at assessment, and this is where organizations examine their own motivations and readiness to merge, and that may or may not lead to a resolution to enter into some kind of negotiations. That second blue circle, negotiation itself, is about identifying and coming to terms with a potential partner or partners, and that itself may or may not end up leading to an agreement to actually merge. The implementation is the third circle, and that's the legal and financial mechanics of making a merger official. And coming out of that, you'll see that purple arrow with integration is really the actual merging of the 2 or more organizations, systems, cultures, and staff into one so that they can move forward as a merged organization. You'll see beneath the diagram how the 7 briefs in the Merger Series align with this process at each step of the way. So beginning on the left with assessment and then moving through the negotiation section and through implementation and integration kinds of issues. So you'll see how those briefs tend to line up with each stage of that process. As I mentioned, we really wanted to make sure this series had something to offer everyone, no matter where you might be in thinking about merger. So the first brief, What is Merger? And that's on pages 1 through 3 of the downloadable document of the Merger Series. It deals with the question of what we even mean by merger. It includes some basic information about terminology and technical aspects of merger, some common motivations, and even a couple of common misconceptions. One of the main ideas we wanted to get across is that nonprofit merger is not just like corporate mergers and acquisitions. Whereas corporate mergers are driven and their success measured by the bottom line in nonprofit mergers is really about mission impact. The idea that mergers will result in immediate cost savings is one of the common misconceptions. Although efficiencies may very well be achieved, larger organizations with greater reach are typically more costly to run. So it can be an oversimplification to think about merger as primarily a financially driven strategy. We want to be realistic about that. But what we have done here is we've included a list of 5 beneficial outcomes merger can and often does help organizations achieve. And you'll see these on the slide. These include combining programming to provide a more integrated response or one-stop access to services, scaling effective programs more broadly, leveraging complementary skills or capacities, and that also includes resources, so there can be savings involved and efficiencies of scale, and attaining greater visibility and advocacy voice. In this brief, What is Merger?, we also preview 2 of our case studies to illustrate the mission impact of mergers. In the first of these, we look at the 2013 merger of Common Ground and Venice Family Clinic. Common Ground recognized the changes in its funding environment was making it untenable to continue its work independently, and it actually approached Venice Family Clinic with a proposal to merge. The match between the 2 made sense for them both because Common Ground was an HIV case management and AIDS service provider, and Venice Family Clinic was a multi-site federally qualified health center, but they both had collaborated before, they had a good relationship, and they pursued mutually compatible missions. So the way this merger got put together, it resulted in the creation of the Venice Family Clinic Common Ground program. And it was mutually beneficial in that not only did Common Ground benefit from Venice Family Clinic's stronger organizational infrastructure, allowing the organization to continue its 20-year history of serving those affected by HIV, but Venice Family Clinic was actually able to expand its scope of services as a full-service medical home by making that harm reduction capacity and expertise its own. They both really ended up getting something out of it and leveraged their complementary strengths. In another example, Colorado Health Network's merger with Howard Dental Clinic expanded access to oral health care for HIV-positive patients. This was a 2014 merger, and it not only preserved essential services that Howard Dental Clinic could no longer sustain on its own, but contributed toward Colorado Health Network's strategic goal of creating a more comprehensive community resource for people affected by HIV. And this was actually a goal it had started to advance in 2011 with the merger of 4 regional ASOs under one umbrella, which provided each of them with greater financial sustainability, collective capacity, both programmatically and as a statewide advocate for HIV/AIDS services. That's the amplified voice piece that I was talking about earlier. That merger of 4 ASOs is actually the subject of a case study that you can actually link to from the What is the Merger brief in case you wanted to learn more about that. So you can see from those 2 cases, the strengths of each partner were amplified, and both organizations ended up benefiting through more effective fulfillment of their missions. But most importantly, it was the clients that ultimately benefited. But merger is not always the right answer. And so the brief on how to conduct a pre-merger assessment, and that's pages 4 and 5, is a really important part of empowering organizations to enter into a merger exploration with their eyes open. So in this brief, we pose 2 sets of questions, and you'll see on the left, we're looking at self-assessment, and that's about examining your organization's motivations and expectations for merger. The brief actually outlines some questions in each of these areas in the bulleted list that are designed to prompt discussion among your senior staff and boards of directors about a potential partnership and what it would mean to you. This is all a critical part of what we think of as organizational readiness for embarking on a merger exploration process, having those kinds of conversations within your organization. On the right, you'll see partner assessment, and those topics really focus on the kinds of things that you'll want to consider about a potential partner before you even approach the other organization. Thinking about these things based on your existing knowledge can help you get a sense of whether the match is consistent with your goals before you pursue it further by actually reaching out to them and starting some kinds of conversations. The brief goes into much more detail on each of these pieces, but the key takeaway I'd like to highlight right now is just to advise that you don't skimp on this assessment phase. For one thing, it's important to take time to get clear on the desired benefits of merger because this is going to lend momentum to and help sustain your effort moving forward. It's a lot of work, and so you really want to know why and have that driving reason. Also, it's better to identify and understand any weaknesses your organization might be bringing to the table prior to entering negotiations than for them to come as a surprise in the middle of a strategic discussion. So really going in with your eyes open. The third brief, How to Navigate Negotiations, and that's on pages 6 and 7, provides a window into the whole negotiations process. But one thing I'd like to highlight from this brief right now is the role of the board and the ways in which the board must be involved. Typically, the negotiations process begins with a board resolution, and this really lays out the terms by which your organization is going to be entering into good faith negotiations, and it creates and charters a negotiations committee. Your board will also be represented on that negotiations committee. So that will include probably at least 2 to 3 board members and 2 to 3 senior staff, including the executive director or CEO. And that group is going to do the work of the negotiations and due diligence. And thirdly, at the end, of course, the whole board is going to be involved in having a decision about whether to merge or not to merge. This brief outlines and describes 7 key areas for negotiations to be thinking about. And also, negotiations are supported by due diligence, really diving into some of the documentation of both or all organizations involved. This brief, we have a separate brief that outlines a comprehensive due diligence checklist. You'll find that on pages 16 through 23. And there's a bunch of key questions and materials that's suggested for you to review. It was developed by Paul Malakovich, General Counsel for AIDS Resource Center of Wisconsin, And I'll let Mike describe whether and how his organization used this tool in his presentation in a few moments. But what it does is it highlights 11 areas of inquiry that can help each partner identify and mitigate to the extent possible any risks or liabilities before entering into a merger agreement. So watch for that due diligence checklist. And before I move on, a quick note on implementation. Negotiation aims at coming up with a resolution on what the partnership will look like, and it results in a document that you can then provide to an attorney who can help you with the appropriate filings to actually legally implement your merger and make it official. We suggest that you try to work with an attorney who has experience with nonprofits and with nonprofits in your state, because things can vary from state to state. So having that legal expertise with a nonprofit perspective can really help save you time and headaches. Moving on to integration. After implementing the merger, integration is really where the rubber meets the road. In this brief, and it's called Case Studies from the Field, that's pages 8 through 10, we include all 4 case studies, each of which highlights a different aspect of integration. You'll see that the slide identifies 10 key areas of integration where organizations need to bring together their systems, policies, and all of that. But integration is not just about those technical aspects of operating the newly merged organization. There's a lot of relational work involved as well. After all, organizations are made up of people. So we'll be talking about cultural integration separately. But right now, let's take a quick look at one of our case studies that highlights how one organization managed some of the technical areas of integration. So the 2011 merger of AIDS Resource Center Ohio, actually Equitas Health, first with Columbus AIDS Task Force and then with Ohio AIDS Coalition, enabled significant growth in the number of patients served as well as the funding to support those services. These mergers also pose complex integration challenges, from weaving together multiple financial systems to integrating programs to defining communications and marketing for the newly merged organization. There was a lot going on. So Equitas Health managed this by forming transition teams for several of the key integration areas. The teams were made up of small groups of staff with representation from each of the merging organizations, and they were charged with identifying integration-related questions, researching possible solutions, making recommendations, and helping to keep the work on track, because that's one of the big challenges, is that you're not only trying to merge, but you've got all your other daily work going on as well at the same time. So it can really be helpful to have folks keeping an eye on that. Other case examples in this particular brief talk about other aspects of integration, including communications, board integration, and cultural integration. So for a little bit more about cultural integration, you've no doubt heard somebody in the sector say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That was an article going around a couple of years ago. It can also really sabotage a merger. Typically, it isn't a failure of the technical integration piece where mergers can go south, but a tendency for organizations to hold on to their individual cultures and identities rather than committing to creating a new culture together for the new organization. So this is why it's so important to create a new merged culture for the new merged organization. I had a little bit of a trouble with this slide. You should be seeing, and imagine, 3 gears, one on top of the other. The first one saying assess, second one saying define, and the third one saying create. What this refers to is 3 steps that we think about when we say organizational culture and creating a new organization. So this is reference to a brief called Introduction to Organizational Culture. You'll find it on pages 11 through 12. And it talks a bit about what we mean by organizational culture and highlights those 3 steps, loosely defined as assess, define, and create. So first, identifying differences and similarities. That's assess. Defining it together is choosing the desired elements of the new culture. And creating that new organizational culture is about making that culture explicit, reinforcing it, keeping it on track, making sure that it gets nurtured, and checking in on it once in a while. So the key takeaway here is really that it's not a one-and-done proposition. You're never really done building a culture. It can be an ongoing process to shape that new identity together, and it's going to take time. So what this brief actually includes is some practical questions to help you assess your organization's current culture. It can be hard to see a culture when you're living in it. So for example, you might want to consider questions like, who's involved in making decisions at my organization? What is the prevailing communication style? Or even, how do you train and onboard new staff? Asking and answering those questions for yourself can help you get an objective read on your own organizational culture, and that will in turn help you better prepare for shaping a new merged culture with a partner organization. Finally, we created a brief around navigating communications and branding, and that's on pages 13 through 15. Because we find that names are so closely tied to an organization's identity, both its image of itself as well as its reputation in the community. While the communications piece has both internal and external components, and this branding piece is only one aspect of merger-related communications, it can be one of the most emotional and potentially contentious issues, that question of what's our name going to be. In this brief, the case studies illustrate a couple of different approaches to naming and branding post-merger, so you'll find some different examples. But right now I want to quickly highlight Boom Health. It's an example of the power of adopting an entirely new name. It's only one choice among many. But what they did is the 2013 merger of Bronx AIDS Services and Citywide Harm Reduction to create Boom Health. It provided seamless access to a full range of prevention, care coordination, behavioral health, and social services. The name Boom Health emerged as a way to communicate a new identity, to say we're going beyond our original mission, BOOM, to transform lives through health and wellness. So while the core mission didn't really change, the merged organization provided an opportunity to deepen the work, and the new name conveyed that sense of excitement, energy, and impact. In this case, the power of that merged name to define a new future for the organization was pretty profound, and it infused its whole outreach with a renewed sense of vitality. You'll see that the brief actually links to a video that tells a bit more of this story and illustrates this for you. So I think Boom Health's rebranding example is a pretty good place to wrap up, because ideally in a merger there should be that sense of excitement about being better together, about what you'll be able to achieve, that merger can create a transformative impact for the people and the communities that you serve. So that was a very quick spin through the merger series. I hope it was helpful, and if I can clarify any of the material from this part of the presentation, do jot your questions down for the Q&A, or feel free to email me at campos@lapiana.org. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Paula.
Thank you, Paula, and I really appreciate everybody on the call today and their interest in the topic of a successful merger. You know, it almost feels like Lance and I are going to be communicating on opposite sides of merger, our organization merging. Lance is choosing to go in another very good strategic direction. Merger may not be the answer for everybody, but I think it is a valuable tool to consider as you are looking at the strategic future of your organization. And we just encourage everybody to keep that focused on what are the needs of people living with HIV and AIDS and those at risk, and not on what are the needs of your organization. Paula, thank you for putting this together, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to introduce and share with everybody on the call today the successful merger between the AIDS Network and ARCW that became effective February 1st of 2015. So I want to give a little bit of history of the two organizations, where they were at prior to the merger. And here you can see the AIDS Network with offices in Madison and Beloit, Wisconsin, smaller footprint in south central Wisconsin, primarily a social service organization, although they had developed a dental clinic, 24 staff, about $1.7 million in revenue, which was pretty stable for them, 400 patients and clients, and about 5,000 people served through prevention efforts. So a relatively small organization that was sort of just continuing the historic services they were able to offer without a lot of expansion. The AIDS Resource Center of Wisconsin, you can see our offices throughout the entire state, a much broader footprint. The HIV medical home model of care listed on the slide here indicates that ARCW is the only organization recognized by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services as an HIV medical home under the Affordable Care Act. We do have 170 staff, 12 clinics and offices through the state, and at the time about $46 million in revenue, 3,000 patients and clients, and about 35,000 people served through prevention efforts. So really quite a growing and dynamic organization. We had been at about $38 million in revenue the year before. We had added about 15 staff in the year prior to 2014, and we're continuing to grow to further implement and perfect our HIV medical home model of care. The AIDS Network's pre-merger perspective, they felt that they needed to expand into medical care, and that's certainly something that I applaud. the AIDS network for. I really believe that AIDS organizations who aren't intimately involved in the provision of medical care are largely going to be irrelevant in the years ahead, and Merger can be a very effective tool to help move in that direction. Their financial resources were stable but limited. It's an organization who had had deficits in 2 of the previous 3 years, not sizable deficits, but deficits all the same. They were struggling with staff retention because they weren't able to give increases, as an example. They felt like they had limited staff and board resources. There was growing competition for funding, including some competition between ARCW and AIDS Network. And they really had a limited supporting services and infrastructure. So its historically important functions like financial management and facilities, information technology, human resources were really underdeveloped at AIDS Network, as they are with many AIDS organizations around the country. ARCW's perspective is really one of interest in expanding services into southern Wisconsin. We were founded as an organization 30 years ago to have a statewide service delivery footprint, and southern Wisconsin was really the area to complete that. A real desire to expand our medical home, really for 2 reasons. One, the quality outcomes that we're able to achieve that are amongst the best in the country. But secondly, from a revenue perspective, without the medical home operating in Madison, the state of Wisconsin in total was losing out on about $1 million in enhanced revenue that medical home would bring forward. We certainly wanted to overcome confusion in the community or within the political sphere. It was quite common for us to receive donations made out to the AIDS Network at one of our offices. We came to learn that it was common for them to receive donations made out to ARCW at their offices. And even within the political sphere, there was always a great question about why 2 organizations. And then finally, ARCW is always looking to gain the knowledge, skills, and abilities of new staff, and really felt like we were able to strengthen our staff through the mergers we had conducted, and we thought the AIDS Network merger would allow us to do that also. So as we move forward, I just really want to compliment AIDS United on the merger series that they're releasing today. And in these slides that move ahead, anything that is in red print, I think really speaks to some of the findings in that merger series that AIDS United put forward. So in early 2014, myself and Dan Glynn, Dan was the executive director of AIDS Network, began a series of discussions about this historic issue of should the 2 organizations merge. Historic because the largest LGBT newspaper in Wisconsin published a letter to the editor in 1998 encouraging the 2 organizations to merge. So it was a conversation that had been happening at different levels for some time. After a series of meetings between Dan and I, we both elected to go independently to our separate boards of directors and encourage the boards to engage in a dialogue around merger. And in May of 2014, each board did agree to discussions. They each passed a motion committing themselves to joint negotiations and discussion around merger. And I just would really reemphasize, it's a point that comes out in the AIDS United merger suite. I would really reemphasize that for everybody on the call, that you need to get your board in and your board committed to these discussions early on. Executive directors can't merge organizations. It does take that board involvement and ultimately ownership. This process was really supported quite nicely by AIDS United and their sector transformation funds. It was an investment that allowed us to retain a third party to help facilitate the discussions. It helped meet some of the meeting costs and other related expenses, including my time and that of my counterparts, to really dedicate a portion of our time and effort knowing that we were receiving the financial backing necessary to evaluate this opportunity. Why did we consider merger? The very first thing that joint committee, the 2 boards each formed a joint committee. Each board appointed 4 people to the committee, and then Dan and myself, so there was 10 of us. The very first thing we did was create a strategic intent, and I can't emphasize the importance of that enough to everybody on the call today. Here's our strategic intent. What did we want to accomplish with the merger? We wanted to improve access to care. We wanted to increase clinical outcomes. We wanted to improve community engagement. We wanted to champion best practices. And then cash, and we wanted to generate additional financial resources. And we sort of cleverly put them all in that C category so it's easy to remember and communicate to our staff, to others on the board, and ultimately to our external stakeholders. But this definition of what we wanted to achieve, what was our strategic intent, was really the guiding the guidepost as we move forward over the course of 10 months of discussions around the merger opportunity. So the discussion process, again, the joint committee, half from the AIDS Network, half from ARCW, 10 meetings. Just because of the dynamics of Madison, Milwaukee, we actually split the difference. Imagine a small town of Johnson Creek, Wisconsin. We went through the strategic intent. On the previous slide, the history piece, there was at times some ill will between the organizations. There were some difficult times where decisions had to be made in the best interest of either organization that wasn't really warmly received by the other organization. But going through that history, not that we agreed, but that people were able to express their viewpoints on the history and how that could be a stumbling block moving forward was in some ways a very empowering meeting that lasted for about 4 hours. The rest of the joint committee meetings really covered a lot of these items that, again, are reiterated in the AIDS United Merger Series, governance, programs. We went one by one through all our programs, so everybody had a good understanding of that. Where were the two organizations financially, human resources, communications. Ultimately, we did decide to move into a due diligence process, and actually the person who did that for us, Paul Milakovich, is highlighted in the AIDS United Merger Series. And then communications. At the end of each joint committee meeting, we agreed on what our public communication statement was going to be. So all 10 of us were leaving with the same messages, which could be as simple as AIDS Network and ARCW continue to meet to determine how to best improve HIV services in the state of Wisconsin. That sort of general statement. We'll have an update for you when there's one available. But keeping that group of 10 on the same message point is really been important to us as we move through the process. As I said, AIDS United was very generous in their support of our merger discussions, allowing us to bring Mary Stilatello in to facilitate the negotiations. Ultimately, she also helped lead the merger integration process for us, really an outstanding professional who brings a lot of experience to the table. I would recommend highly to anyone. This idea of having that third party, that unbiased person, is particularly important in our situation because there was some sense of inequality between the organizations. ARCW at the time at 46 million, AIDS Network at 1.7 million, ARCW having offices throughout the state, AIDS Network just being in Madison and Blake. There was sort of a us versus them, maybe a little David and Goliath sense, and we really worked hard. Mary brought to the table the idea that this is two organizations who are equals as best we can be in the fight against AIDS, and that really helped negotiations. Mary brought forward a very thorough process that allowed to have a very informed decision at the end of the process. The other person I mentioned earlier, due diligence. Again, there's a really nice piece in the merger series being released today by AIDS United on due diligence. Paul Milakovich really authored that piece for AIDS United, and that was what we used, a comprehensive financial and legal assessment of the two organizations. Paul's done this for a number of nonprofits in the HIV and the LGBT arenas, and I highly recommend him for folks who need somebody to focus on due diligence. So February 1, 2015, the two organizations merged. We actually announced it right before Christmas, December of 2014. I worked very hard to onboard everybody into the ARCW system. And then we really moved into an era of focusing on integration and culture. Again, AIDS United stepped forward with their strategic transformation funds to help support this process in a lot of ways. That February 1st effective date is the start line and not the finish line for effective merger. And we went through a very significant integration process. Initially, we did a cultural assessment. What was the AIDS Network culture? What was the ARCW culture? But looking at our strategic intent, it wasn't adopting one or the other of those. It was championing best practices. We actually developed a new market-based culture at ARCW that focuses in on increasing access to care, improving the quality of care we offer, and making sure we're financially viable. We used a tool, OCAI, that Mary Stellatello brought to the table and was very, very helpful to us. The whole integration process, we had internal integration teams focused on different program areas and then corporate or supporting services. There were 8 teams with about 75 employees who participated. They all volunteered, about 40% of our staff. And that was a process that went on for the whole first year post-merger, wrapped up in January of 2016. A lot of focus, again, on communications, both internal to the staff. I initiated a blog for staff. There's other ways that we would communicate. And then externally, we did a lot of marketing of the new organization. You know, interestingly, for us, there wasn't much conversation about the issue of name, and I know others will talk about that on the call today. But for us, it really became clear that there was a lot of brand equity in ARCW, candidly more brand equity in ARCW because of the statewide reach of the organization than AIDS Network. I would imagine it took us all of about 30 to 45 minutes to decide that the merged organization would operate under the name the AIDS Resource Center of Wisconsin. So not all the communications issues like name are always sticky wickets, and we were able to move forward with it, really, again, focused on what would be in the best interest of people living with HIV as we move forward. This takes time. It took much more time to do the integration process than the merger negotiation process. It became a time of great fatigue for some of us who had been added already a year prior to the integration process, but it's time that is really well spent. The two organizations have come together very nicely. The outcome, so I just want to go back to our strategic intent. What have we done with access to care? Medical home is opened in Madison, new mental health services, new medical services, a pharmacy. We've increased the number of lives saved through overdose prevention, better clinical outcomes. We've reengaged in care 25 people with HIV who have been out of care. Our quality assurance program is in place. Community engagement, we've had record attendees in Madison area, special events, champion best practices from the AIDS Network. We improved our food services using some of their policies and eligibility thresholds. The Felicia Milton Smith gift drive is a wonderful holiday gift drive that now operates statewide. This merger allowed us to create a compliance department headed by Dan Gwynn, who was the former executive director at AIDS Network. And then on the cash front, increased pharmacy revenue, first time ever healthcare reimbursement revenue. We've raised $500,000 in new private revenue. Actually, since this slide was printed, that number should be updated to $700,000 as we've been able to generate new private resources. Interestingly, not just in Madison, but in other parts of Wisconsin also who wanted to make an investment in the merger. So we really feel like that guidepost that we set up in early 2014 helped us through the whole negotiation process, the integration process, and we continue to measure ourselves on those 5 key outcome areas. Some lessons learned for what it's worth to everybody on the call today, shifting the conversation on a merger to focus on what's gained rather than what's lost. What's improved for people with HIV rather than I work for a different organization. What are the additional services that are available rather than, oh, we're going to lose some sense of identity or name or local autonomy. To identify the deal breakers very early on. It makes no difference about how long you're going to negotiate if there are just some firm deal breakers. We were able to identify that in the first couple of meetings under Mary Stellatello's leadership and moved through them pretty quickly. It turned out that the deal breakers on one side were not deal breakers on the other side. And we did focus a lot of our effort on integration, just the merge part of the organization, the Madison and Beloit areas coming to ARCW, and it became really clear to us that we should have focused more on the entire enterprise. And much can be achieved, and it doesn't take that long. Some of these merger stories go on for years. The idea that We started meeting in June of 14. We merged on February of 15, and we were fully integrated a year later with medical, dental, mental health, pharmacy services. It does indicate that we can move pretty quickly through these things. Here's my name and contact information, telephone, email. I would welcome any calls and any questions that I could answer from all of you in attendance today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Paula. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paula, and thanks to AIDS United and La Piana Consulting for pulling this really important webinar together. Again, my name is Lance Thoma. I'm the CEO of Asian and Pacific Islander Wellness Center. And just to start off about who we are, API Wellness Center is an organization in San Francisco in the Tenderloin neighborhood. And our mission is to transform lives by advancing health, wellness, and equality for people of all races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, gender identities, and immigration statuses. You can see kind of our mission and our vision, and this is something that we've put together in the past few years, and this represents a huge transformation for API Wellness Center over our 29 years of being starting as an HIV nonprofit that serves specifically the Asian and Pacific Islander community here in San Francisco. And what you see, and why I start with this, is that this mission actually is a reflection of a pretty expansive transformation that we as an HIV organization have been upon over the past many years. We transformed in many ways from an HIV organization into a broader health organization, from an API organization to one that serves all communities of color, and an organization that has claimed its identity as an LGBTQ and people of color health organization. And what this reflects is, not only do we do HIV work, but we provide a number of services to the LGBT community, specifically for the transgender community. We offer the largest transgender program here in San Francisco, and we operate a drop-in program for all transgender men and women and anyone who identifies as trans here in San Francisco. And most recently, just last year, we became a federally qualified health center. But what I will also say in terms of our history is that in 1997, API Wellness Center emerged as from a merger of two other organizations here in San Francisco. And it was another moment in the 90s when there was another push for organizations, HIV organizations, to merge, and especially ones that were smaller and serving smaller communities and smaller organizations. So there were two organizations that actually merged to become API Wellness Center. And actually we did work with La Piana Consulting to move us through that process. And what I will say is that to what some of the other speakers have mentioned, that organizational culture, it takes so much time to and we must pay attention to that in any merger, because what I realized is when I came into the organization in 1999, that was still real and such a big, huge issue for the organization to deal with, and something that I worked on when I entered into the organization and at that time. In 2006, I became the executive director of API Wellness Center, and a few years into that is when there was this next kind of wave of the HIV sector really needing to transform, and there was a call for that just because funding was changing. I think the epidemic was shifting. And so there was a lot in our environment that really was calling on organizations to really rethink how they were providing services and how they were sustaining their organizations for the long term. So at that point, about 5 or 6 years ago is when we really did as an organization look and see what we needed to do. I think my relationship with my board of directors was strong, and our partnership as we were looking ahead, it really was about how do we make sure that we were being as strategic and innovative and risk-taking and audacious so that we could sustain what we were doing and to actually evolve and expand over time. This was something that not just, I think here in San Francisco at API Wellness Center, but I also serve on the board of NMAC. And we were also saying to organizations, and especially those that served communities of color, that we needed to really look at how we were doing our business and challenge ourselves to even think about strategic restructuring possibilities, and that we couldn't be afraid to do that. And so I worked with my board to ensure that API Wellness Center was heeding that kind of sector wisdom in order to ensure that our services that we're serving the most vulnerable in our communities could be sustained and even expanded to even more folks who needed the kinds of services that we provided. So it was probably in 2012 when we started to claim our identity not just as an HIV organization but as an LGBTQ organization, is when we looked in the sector here in San Francisco in the environment, and there were 2 other organizations that were doing some amazing work in the LGBTQ community that I reached out to, and we came together to think together about what the 3 of us could be doing for the LGBTQ community here in San Francisco. We entered into that work, and we stayed with it for a good year to a year and a half. Our boards met together, and we started to do this very deeper dive into how we could partner together, up into including what would a merger look like. It was probably, I think, in 2014 when one of the organizations exited that partnership for their own reasons. And then the 2 remaining were us and the San Francisco LGBT Center. And I think based on the work we had done, we actually took stock and said, actually, we want to continue our strategic restructuring, strategic partnership conversation and work, because there was so much there that we felt like the community could embrace and that we could do for the community. And so we with AIDS United support, we actually embarked on a dual strategic partnership conversation. And what you can see here is that, both boards passed resolutions to launch this work. We assembled a steering committee of 3 board and 3 staff from each organization to meet regularly to do due diligence around our financials, our donor bases, our organizational structures, and we did a crosswalk between the organizations to assess how we could make this possible, to actually make a merger possible. What we also did concurrently is that because we didn't have a strict timeline, we didn't have to do this by a certain point, there wasn't any financial risk that that either organization was in. We did with our consultant, who we worked with Compass Point, and their CEO, Jean Bell, was our lead consultant on this. What we did concurrently to the due diligence process was that we actually said we need actually our programmatic staff to meet and to think strategically at the same time. Because what we were seeing in the sector was that mergers also fell apart or derailed or got even more complicated when the frontline programmatic staff, when mid-managers never had the chance to help think through what a merged organization could look like. And so the staff from both of our organizations started meeting and planning together. And this was actually exciting because actually on the ground, as we were doing the higher level governance and due diligence programmatically, there were already work being done. There were opportunities being identified, and we collaborated on many different proposals together over the many months that we were working together around envisioning and formulating what our partnership could look like. Ultimately, what I want to say, what you see here is that we did make a decision not to merge. And why we did that was that as we were working together, as I mentioned earlier, API Wellness Center achieved its federally qualified health center status. And this was a huge game changer for API Wellness Center. And something that we had been working on for some time, but didn't think that we would be getting that designation when we did. And so that became a huge point of transformation for us last year. And at the same time, the LGBT Center here in San Francisco actually acquired resources and was successful in acquiring several millions of dollars in new market tax credits to launch a multi-million-dollar building renovation project, which they had been working on for many, many years. And so all of this came together, and when we looked at what our two organizations were embarking on, what we really saw was that in some ways we were actually achieving the goals for our communities broadly that we had come together to achieve as a merged organization. And I think what we realized was that we needed to focus on our organizations, but that we could be stronger even by being aligned together, and to ensure that this strategic alliance that we had built was solidified. And so when we made the decision not to merge, we also made a very conscious decision to align, and that's when I talk about our strategic alliance. And when I talk about that, you can see some of the components, how we envisioned it, but it really was that we were going to be publicly aligned and partnered, and that was we wanted to role model that for the community and to share how we were planning together and how we were going to be model partners, and how I think we wanted to be that kind of partner that other organizations could look to, and we could build that partnership, even build that out. We also wanted to make sure that we were leveraging both of our transformations and that we were actually helping each other through that. We saw that having the boards working together, senior staff working together, program staff, we actually, in some ways, it was because of that we were achieving what we were achieving separately, but in some ways because we were supporting each other through each of these milestones that we were achieving. And I also think that we had such a big vision for the community, and we didn't see it as just our vision. It was a vision that we had for the community, and we wanted to make sure that we were being open and inclusive as possible, and inviting people into that conversation as well. And when I think back about it, I do see that in any kind of partnership conversation, what I see is that, the executive director and their board need to have a strong partnership. And Rebecca Rolfe, who is the ED at the San Francisco LGBT Center, and I both have that kind of relationship with our boards. And that Rebecca and I share a belief and a value system, and I think that allowed us to be able to work so closely together and to be aligned throughout this process, and to be able to check each other in some ways so that, you know, as executive directors of these two organizations, we weren't derailing the process unintentionally. So we were able to do that for each other. Ultimately, in terms of results, and I've talked about that through my talk today, but you know, I think what we as a result of this process, we actually have come and aligned around a broader community vision that both of our organizations are working towards. And in some ways, because of the work that we did together, I really think we are actually stronger organizations because of it. And now San Francisco has actually two very strong organizations that are working towards this big vision for around HIV and LGBTQ health in San Francisco. What you see here also on-the-ground program collaboration, we actually were successful in receiving two pretty significant grants collaboratively. So one is our Queer Violence Prevention Collaborative that was funded by the City of San Francisco for the two of our organizations to do a project on the ground here together, addressing queer violence and working to prevent that. And secondly, we were both received a grant collaboratively from the state of California to do a 5-year mental health demonstration project together that's going to serve not just the LGBT community here in San Francisco, but we'll be able to share the lessons learned from that mental health program collaboration. And then finally what you see is that we committed to being an anchor tenant in the soon-to-be newly remodeled LGBT Center building at the end of 2016. And so there will be a satellite clinic that we will have there while we are still grounded here in what the neighborhood is, the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And maybe just to end by saying that, you know, what we learned from this merger discussion is that even though we chose not to merge, what we did fully see was that this process allowed us to both be stronger. It allowed us to achieve milestones and successes that I'm not sure we would have achieved if we hadn't supported each other through this process. And we are we see ourselves as long-term committed partners together serving the most vulnerable here in San Francisco. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.